The Shroud of Turin now has a 3D image. Is this really Jesus, or is it somebody else? Coming up next on Deceptions of the Ages News. Hello everybody and welcome to Deceptions of the Ages News. First thing, of course, is I have to thank everybody for subscribe. Oh boy, I almost said it. For SUBSCRIBING. I hope that thing can't spell. Oh no, it can. Oh boy. Oh boy, ouch. That really smarts. So yeah, if you guys could go ahead and subscribe, especially you down in Texas and you over there in South Dakota, get away from those sheep and go ahead and hit that subscribe button. All right, everybody. The first thing we're going to talk about today is, of course, this amazing 3D image of Jesus on the Shroud of Turin. Now, before we go too much farther, we have to look at all of the possibilities, as we always do on Deceptions of the Ages News. All right, so the first thing we need to look at is what are the possibilities of this shroud being Jesus. Well, the first thing that we need to do is ask ourselves, what do we know about what Jesus looked like? Answer, nothing. There weren't any cameras back then. There certainly weren't any iPhones or smartphones to take pictures. So we have nobody's idea of what Jesus looked like. Even in the Bible, there's no description of him. So all we really have is these artists' renditions of Jesus. Now, what you are going to notice as we look at these different depictions of Jesus is that he has suddenly gone from being what we call a Sephardic Jew, which means a Jew who lived in the Holy Land back in that time and would have actually resembled somebody more like a Jerry Seinfeld with nice, handsome features, probably shorter in stature, curly hair, and very robust physically, and very generally handsome. So is this really a picture of a Sephardic Jew from the time period of Jesus? Well, let's look at some other possibilities. Before we continue any farther, let me tell you a little story. Now, this story took place in the year 1098, 1099, and we are at the city of Antioch, which is in current modern-day Turkey. And why we're in Antioch is because there are thousands of Crusaders heading for the Holy Land, and they are actually captured, surrounded in the city of Antioch. They are starving, they have no water, and they are surrounded by thousands of Muslims and Turks who are ready to kill them for invading their country. So what they need is they need a miracle. Now, why is this important? It is important because the Catholic Church has a invested interest in what we call relics, religious relics, any artifacts, whether true or not, that can be traced to the life of Jesus, the Bible, or the Gospels. So the spear that penetrated Christ's side inspired the Crusaders to warfare against the Muslims, and they went into Jerusalem, sacked it, and occupied it for a few hundred years. We are in a similar time of crisis of faith where we seem to be surrounded by people who do not like Christians. They are atheists. They're people who just hate Jesus for whatever reason. I don't know why you would hate somebody who went around doing good to other people, but that's how people are these days. Anyway, in this time of crisis, the Catholic Church sees the Shroud of Turin as that old relic hidden in the Church of Antioch, the spear that penetrated Christ's side. So they are using this shroud to inspire faith in the millions of Catholics, maybe billions of Catholics around the world, to inspire them to keep their faith and to not drift away. But is this really going to work? Well, once we start looking at this Shroud of Turin and its subsequent 3D image, we start to see some things that are mighty suspicious. The first one, of course, being already mentioned, that this really looks like a European. Now, as we talked about before, the Europeans had come down during the Crusades to take Jerusalem after it had been conquered 100 years before the Crusades by the Seljuk Turks. So, the Europeans, the Crusaders, they are led by a cadre of what are basically Swedes, Norwegians, Finnish Vikings who came into England, France, Italy, and set themselves up as nobles because they were ruthless, they were brutal, and they killed just about everybody they could find. Anybody left alive was so happy to be left alive that they immediately swore loyal to these new warlords. Now, in 1098, Pope Urban of the Catholic Church called on these warlords to stop killing each other and their peasants in the crusade down in Jerusalem. So they answered the call and they moved down into Jerusalem. So this is where we start looking at the story of the Shroud of Turin and the wounds that are on it, and we compare them with what actually happened during the Crusades in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. Now let's start with another story. When the Crusaders finally succeeded in taking Jerusalem, the first thing that they needed to do was to take the outlying lands, because it's the Middle East and you need farmland and water. And there's not a lot of that in just the confines of Jerusalem, which sits on the top of mountains. So the Crusaders went out and they conducted campaigns against local princes that were of the Muslim faith. And what would happen during these battles is that these Crusaders, who were what we would call real badasses, they wore very heavy chainmail, they carried big swords and spears, and they rode Clydesdale horses that could basically run over any of their opposition. So these heavily armored knights and their accompanying infantry would go out and do battle against the Muslims. Now, the Muslims had a completely different battle tactic, and that was what we call the swarm. And if you want to know more about the swarm, look up a thesis paper done by Dr. Matt Schofling, who was a colleague of. Now, the swarm concept of battle is that everybody gets on their horse and they just attack at once, right? And this eliminates a person being singled out and increases your chance of survival. Europeans fought a little bit differently. They fought single combat. They wanted one-on-one combat, and so it was very hard for their big Clydesdales to chase down these Arab quarter horses, which were really, really fast. And because the Arabs didn't wear very much armor, they were able to move very quickly. So the point in all this is that during circle and circle and circle the Crusader formations, and they would launch arrows after arrows, so that after the first battle, where Godfrey of Bouillon, the first king of Jerusalem, came back, he was all by himself. With him was a long train of the items that he had captured, but his army was gone. And he was so happy to have captured all of this stuff, he didn't notice that he looked like what we would call a porcupine. The guys that came back from battles during those crusades were just stuck with arrows in their chain mail, right? Because those arrows would penetrate a little bit and then they just stick. So they would come back from battle just full of arrows. Now, remember, these Crusader knights were on horses. So in order to defeat them, they had to be taken off the horse. So let's think about that for a second, and then let's compare the wounds on the image in the Shroud of Turin. Now, the wounds on the image of the Shroud of Turin have a pierce wound in the side. They show puncture wounds on the back that are very small. Now, the people who are claiming that this is the body of Jesus say that this is from him being whipped while he's carrying the cross. Not true. These wounds could probably more easily be identified as the marks from chainmail as you fall off the back of your horse and you're dragged through the ground as a captive. So the subsequent wounds on this body do not really match the wounds of Jesus. If there are head wounds on him, those head wounds would come from him receiving blows to his steel helmet. Of course, all around his body were spears and arrows. So what about the nail mark, supposed nail mark in the foot? Well, imagine if you were going to drag a person, you might just stick them with something. Maybe the body is dead, maybe it's deceased. But anyway, this body does not really have any or very few of the wounds that would be attributed to the death of Jesus, but really look more like a dead Crusader knight. So who could this Crusader knight be? And before we talk about that, let's look at one more piece of evidence. Look at this body a little bit more closely. Look at the arms on this guy. Look at his chest. All right, so we can say, yeah, maybe the sculptor embellished a little bit. Maybe he tried to make him look more godlike than normal in the spirit of the Greeks and the Romans. But this really doesn't do Christianity any justice, because the fact of the matter is, this guy in the in the 3D image, he looks like a pretty athletic person. He looks like he does a lot of working out. Now, from the Gospels, we don't hear anything about Jesus being a boxer or a weightlifter or a runner. So the last piece of evidence I want to throw at you as to who this guy could be is the fact that they say that looking at the shroud, they have determined that this person had a dislocated right shoulder. Now, what do you do with your right arm when you live in the Middle Ages and you're on a crusade? You use that arm to wield a big heavy sword, a mace, or an axe. So when you have a dislocated arm, guess what? You can't fight anymore. You're out of commission. And at that time, you can be dragged off your horse, captured, or killed. So these are all evidences. This is a Crusader knight. Most likely he is being taller. He's probably from Norway or Scandinavia, where they do generally tend to be taller than everybody else. His facial features, his beard, they all denote the descriptions of people who lived back during the Middle Ages, during the time of the Crusades. So what I think it is, in all of the irony that you could imagine, is that this man, this dead Crusader knight, is no more than a knight of the temple. I believe that he is a very rich lord, a noble who went down to fight the Crusades. He was killed there, and because he was rich, most of the poor people who fought in the Crusades were beheaded on the spot. But the people who had some nobility, who had some wealth, who could pay off the Muslims who captured them, they were allowed to go. So what happened with this guy is that most likely he was killed in battle. The Muslims ransomed his body, to his family or his lieges, people, his vassals who were loyal to him, and then his body was wrapped in this cloth, and it was either buried, or I doubt it was shipped back to Italy, because that would have taken too long. But most likely the body was buried, and at some point in time the shroud ended up back in Italy. So in all of this, the Freemasons may have gotten the final laugh on the Catholic Church, because if you don't know anything about the history of the Freemasons, in 1305 the Catholic Church declared the Knights Templar, the predecessor of the Freemasons, an outlaw organization, and burned a lot of them at the stake and tried to seize their fortune. But in this case, it looks like a Crusader knight managed to sneak his way back in, even though he was dead, and find himself in the litany and the religious dogma of the Catholic Church. Pretty amazing stuff. Do you believe it or not? Let me know what you think. Comment below, and please don't forget to... This is Deceptions of the Ages News. We'll see you next time.